notice the tribulation that Jesus is warning us about. First, he's warning his disciples, but they became the established founders of what we would later call the Christian church. At least from a Gentile perspective, we could say that. I don't believe that the church started in the first century, but that's a different discussion. Germane to my point is that he's warning first his disciples and then warning us. But this is built itself on Old Testament passages where Daniel was told that there would be a time of trouble for Jacob. We can even call it Jacob's troubles if we want to call it that. And there would be this time of persecution where the little horn of Daniel chapter 4 and Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 9, 10, and 11, 9, 10, 11, and 12, the little horn, this figure would wear out the saints. He would persecute the saints. He would break down the power of the saints. He would shatter the power, I think is one version describes it in Daniel. So the theology of being persecuted as a child of God, as a follower after God, goes all the way back to the Old Testament. This gives us the theology of the tribulation being designated for those who follow after God, but more specifically, like Jesus said, following after Jesus himself. In fact, it's unmistakable here. I'll just highlight it. Yeshua says to the disciples, "They will hand you over to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations." He doesn't stop there. Notice he gives a context for the tribulation. He says you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. So this is not just your generic version of Jewish persecution that some people might glean if you only read the Old Testament passages and said, aha, someday Israel's going to suffer this horrendous tribulation period, and they're going to need this salvation and deliverance from it. There'll be this great persecution. In fact, I do want to show this to you because it's worth seeing it for yourself so you know that I'm not speculating or making it up. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 is good enough. "Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be, ready for it, a time of distress." How bad? "Such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time, and at that time your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued." Sounds like tribulation leading to rapture to me. "And many of those," and then we have the resurrection language brought in because it must be there. Resurrection and rapture are included as a package deal. Look at verse 2. "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." So my point is that when Jesus says that there will be this great tribulation in verse 9, there's a couple of things that stand out for us. Number one, the tribulation is for the name of Jesus. It's for his sake. He says, because of my name. Number two, the tribulation is targeting believers because it says, they will hand you over to tribulation and kill you. Who's the they? In the verse, the they must be non-Christians. Could be Jews, could be people of the world, could be governments, could be magistrates, rulers, leaders, could be Caesars. And we know from history that the Christians suffered persecution at the hands of those who weren't Christians, right? First century martyrdom was great. It was horrendous. But Yeshua is saying that there's coming a day that is going to be unlike any other time period, based on what Daniel just said, and Yeshua is going to echo that sentiment. There's going to come a day that Christians, those who are followers after Jesus, right, because it says my name, that you specifically are going to be the target of those who don't agree with you or don't believe that you should have a life on planet Earth. They're going to hand you over to tribulation and kill you. They, who's the they? That's my point. So tribulation at this point in time must be seen as targeting Christians, but also it is allowed, just like we had in Daniel. Daniel wasn't reading Daniel 12, 1 and 2 and saying, in fact, let's go back to Daniel for a second and I'll be humorous. Let me reread it from a Christian, insert some Christianese. "Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the Christians of your people will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation unto that time. And at that time, the Christians among you, the Jews, everyone who's found written in the book will be rescued. So notice I just inserted the word Christians, but that wasn't there originally. You think Daniel read those words or heard those words from the angel and said, oh, wow, there's going to be some Christians. They're going to be persecuted, and we're going to be the target of everyone around us, and blah, blah, blah. He probably didn't think that way. That's kind of an anachronistic way of reading the Bible. However, it is safe to say that the elect, is where I'm going with my little digression here. When we talk about the elect of God, those who are chosen by God to bear his name and to carry his truths, we must recognize that the Bible presents two levels of the elect. One of them is Israel as a people group. They are the elect chosen out from among the nations to be the bearers of the good news and the gospel and the truths of God's word to the surrounding nations. They're the ambassadors, the original group. As a group, they're not the first persons to have this responsibility. I mean, it goes all the way back to Noah and he's a preacher of righteousness. Cain, Abel himself was the righteous of the two between he and his brother. Different righteous individuals that show up before Israel shows up on the scene. So that's not the point I'm trying to make. But when we finally get to Israel, we have this very clear picture of a separation of a righteous group out away from an unrighteous group for the purpose of being the ambassadors of God's truth to take it right back to those people who are not the chosen. Israel's the original chosen group as a group, not an individual, right? Noah was chosen, Abraham was chosen. I get that. Moses was chosen. I'm not discounting that fact, so don't misunderstand me. The point is, by the time we get to Daniel, there's already a group known as Israel. And so we can say, your people. So I don't think Daniel was imagining that there's a group in his people that are Christian per se, although he knew that there was righteous remnant. That language is definitely Old Testamental. We do recognize that there's always been a righteous remnant within the larger group of people. But germane to my point is that it is entirely accurate to call Israel as a group, even though there's many of them inside of the group are unrighteous, the entire group themselves are recognized by God when compared against the nations as elect. And how do I know that? How can I say that with certainty? Because when we jump over to the book of Revelation and drop down to chapter 12 and pick up our reading, we've got this woman being described by John in his vision, and she's clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and she was pregnant, and she cried out, and she gives birth to a male child. And this male child is Jesus. It's obvious from the passage that it's Jesus. There's this dragon that shows up that's obvious that it's Satan in the second part, and he tries to kill this male child, but he gets caught up to heaven, and he's protected by God. And this really makes the dragon angry, right? That's what we read in this verses 5 through 6. But then something interesting happens. There's this war in heaven between this dragon and Michael and his archangels. And this war results in Satan and his angels getting cast down to earth. Where am I going with this? Just follow along. This has to do with the elect. This war results in Satan getting cast down to earth, and he comes down to earth with great wrath. He's really angry. Look at verse 12. For this reason, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that he's only a short time. So in his wrath, as he comes down to earth, what does he do? That's where we pick up the interesting part of the narrative. Verse 13, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, what did he do? He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Tell me, in verse 13, who is the woman that gave birth to the male child? It's obviously Israel. In one sense, it's also the church, but we don't need to exclude the fact that it's Israel because historically, that is the picture painted by the Tanakh. It's that Israel gave birth to the Messiah. It's the sons of Abraham, of which the Messiah would come through one of the sons' lineage, namely Judah. But Judah is the son of Abraham. It's a family affair. So we don't have to kind of say that the we don't have to exclude Israel from this picture by saying that the woman is the church and she's the one that gave birth to the male child. In fact, according to classic dispensationalism, the church wasn't born when Jesus was born, right? Tell me I'm right, because I know that's how dispensationalism works. The church wasn't born until when? When's their birthday? Pentecost. Well, of course, I don't follow that theology, but classic dispensationalists do, and many Christians are taught that the church was born at Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. Well, guess what? Jesus has already since long been gone by Pentecost. So how can you say that in Revelation 12, verse 13, that the woman who gave birth to the male child is the church, when you also teach that the church wasn't born until Acts chapter 2? Last time I checked, that's after Jesus was already born, lived, died, resurrected, and went on to heaven. So it's better just to concede the church was not the one that gave birth to the male child. It's actually Israel who was in existence when Jesus was born. So what's my point? We can now kind of work backwards to go backwards to Matthew. And when Jesus talks about they're going to hand you over to tribulation and kill you and be hated by all nations because of my name, we can see that it is Israel who shares in the tribulation, but specifically, there's a part of the tribulation that will target Christians. But my point is, I suppose I skipped a very important part of Revelation. If you jump back over to Revelation chapter 12, the dragon goes after the woman, and when the earth helps the woman in verse 14, 15, and 16, then in verse 17, the dragon is enraged with the woman and went off to make war with who? The rest of her children, who do what? Keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of who? Jesus. There's your church. Yeah. The rest of her children. Who's the her? The woman. Who's the woman? Israel. Who would be the rest of her children? Naturally, we could call this, you can say it's Messianic Jews if you want to, and I would agree with that as well. But now I think we have good warrant for calling the rest of her children here the church. How do I know? Because it describes them as keeping the commandments of God and holding to the testimony of Jesus. Again, you can call this Messianic Jews, but by the time that John wrote this, the church was already in existence. So there's no good reason to leave the church out of this particular narrative at this point in time. So now we can work backwards to Matthew and realize that the tribulation that Jesus is talking about is a tribulation that is aimed at the woman and more specifically the children, the rest of her offspring, meaning the Christians. So really, it's Jews and Christians that are going to experience the Great Tribulation, but there's a part of it that will specifically target Christians because of Satan's intense hatred for Jesus himself. Because Jesus says, you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. Also notice that you'll be hated by all nations. It doesn't say the devil will hand you over to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by the devil because of my name. Jesus says you'll be hated by the nations. So we know that the influence of the tribulation will be the nations doing the bidding of the Antichrist, doing the bidding of the false prophet, doing the bidding of the dragon himself in order to create this tribulation. So now, I've been following this little tangent for a while. Let's get back on track. What's the significance of this tribulation and the timing of it and who it's targeting? The significance is that when we start in verse 9, this is the first time we use the word tribulation in Yeshua's discourse. It's from there that we build our context to talk about therefore in verse 15 when you see the abomination of desolation. This is a therefore that's sharpening the context begun earlier when he says then in verse 9. So this creates a context as far as sequential occurrences of the 70th week of Daniel. The abomination of desolation is a midpoint event. We know that because Daniel told us in the middle of the week he'll put the sacrifices to an end. The middle of the week, the middle of the Shavua, the middle of the Heptad, the middle of the 7 years. And so from there we also have Yeshua then telling us in verse 21, for then there'll be a great tribulation. He's just highlighting the fact that this will be what Daniel already talked about, a tribulation unlike any other that has ever occurred on planet Earth. For who? The woman and her offspring. Who's the woman? Israel. Who's her offspring? The church. So that's why the tribulation is singling out this people group. And then we have the classic verse 22, those days being cut short. What are those days? Those days are those days of the tribulation. I'm purposely saying those days, just to make the emphasis on the article and the what do we call it? Something pronoun, a definite pronoun, those, I'm losing my grammar words here, and I'm a grammar teacher. Don't tell anyone. All right, so it's within that context again that we can now get down to verse 29, where we started. We come full circle, where Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of what? Those days, right? He uses tribulation, and he says those days. So it's the same tribulation that was cut short earlier when he says, unless those days had been cut short. Right, in verse 22. And if those days, what days? Those days of tribulation, great tribulation that he mentioned in the previous sentence. That's the immediate context. And so when we get to verse 29, he doesn't have to say the great tribulation, immediately after the great tribulation of those days. Indeed, if we compare Matthew to Mark, Mark doesn't even use the word great. So don't get hung up on the word great here. It is the fact that there's really only one time period that Jesus is describing, and it's a time period known as the Great Tribulation in one discourse version, like Matthew, but it's simply known as the tribulation in other versions like Mark and Luke, but it's still only one period. And it's that time period that's cut short, and it's that time period that is the object of Yeshua's discussion when he talks about the sun being dark and the moon not giving us light, and then sequentially we'll see this sign of the coming of the Son of Man, and then sequentially we'll have this gathering. So those are the sequences created by the narrative. Now we're coming back around. I've got like 2 minutes left. I'll probably just keep plugging away at this chart, and we won't finish this tonight. Wrath of God occurs after the rapture, often seen as part of Christ's return, according to classic post-trib. Wrath of God occurs after the rapture, but they don't say how long the rapture is. The Prewrath Rapture, as I'm already comparing, God's wrath begins after the rapture and is distinct from the tribulation period. So we've kind of come full circle where I just did a little background look at wrath of God, tribulation. We haven't really even got into wrath of God per se, because all the little thing that I just took you through with Daniel and Revelation and Matthew and things like that really is tribulation language. Wrath of God is something you really have to pick up from other parts of the Bible other than the Olivet Discourse, such as the whole Old Testament prophets that talk about the wrath of God that's going to be poured out one day. And then you also start to pick it up when you see Paul speaking of this fiery judgment that's going to be poured out against God's enemies and against those who persecute God's people. Peter's going to talk about this language, the fire that's reserved for the end of time that's going to be poured out against the wicked. Paul already mentioned it in Romans 2, the wrath of God that's reserved for people. I'm going to close with this concept. When we're talking about tribulation and wrath, if you're going to live righteously for God or for his Messiah, there's going to be tribulation. And so there's going to be persecution. There's going to be mocking. It's going to be a hard life in some regards, because the world in general is not following after God's ways. And so there's always going to be that opposition to doing what's right. So you can basically anticipate that there's going to be tribulation in your life if you're going to live righteously. There's even a verse, and I'll flash this in post-production, something to the effect of all those who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. I think those are the words of Paul. I just don't remember which book it comes from. However, using that same kind of principle of if you're going to live righteously, there's going to be persecution. There's also a principle built into the Bible that God, because he's a righteous God, must judge wickedness. And so there's also to some degree that God's wrath is being experienced in real time right now as he judges wicked human beings. It's not the eschatological wrath that we're talking about. It's not the same as that, yet the label can still be called wrath of God, and it's not the the final separation from God wrath, where you're eternally separated from God after the great white throne judgment, after the final judgment, where there's no more time left in your life, where you're spending eternity in hell. It's not that wrath either. Rather, I'm talking about right now in real time, God can and does punish wicked people. And how do I know this? And I'm just going to close with this. I'll just pull up one passage. It is in Romans chapter 1, near the very end, starting in verse 18. And I'll just read just this part and then I'll close. Paul tells the church at Rome that the wrath of God, I'll just read it, this is in ASB, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven, not will be, not someday by and by in the end, not at the end of days, but is, right? Present tense. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. To be sure, the crime that's being committed by these people is also present tense. Notice it says, people who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. I believe that's present tense verbiage there for suppress. I'll look up the Greek later, but I don't want to distract right now. But germane to my point is that the wrath of God is presently being revealed from heaven. It's being revealed now, for the wrath of God is revealed. Verse 19, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, being understood by what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And so you can go on and read the rest if you want. In fact, I recommend reading the rest in terms of your own homework for this week. But just know, my warning to the wicked, if you happen upon this particular video, I don't know why you would look at this video if you're someone who's not interested in eschatology or the Bible, but maybe just by chance you find this video and you've made it all the way to the end of my teaching. If you're not found righteous in God, and this means in Messiah, then right now the wrath of God quite possibly could be felt by you. God doesn't have to wait till the 70th week to pour out his wrath on you. I don't know what that would look like. I'm not God. I'm just going by what the Bible says. The wrath of God is revealed. This was written 2,000 years ago, and it's present tense then, which means it must be present tense now. At the same time, if you're saying, "No, Ariel, I'm not experiencing any wrath and I don't believe in God or Jesus. I'm doing fine. My portfolio's fine. My stocks are fine. My bank account's fine. My family's fine. My position at work is fine. I am just sitting high on the hog." Well, then my warning to you is there's still a coming wrath. There's gonna be a time on earth when God will pour out his wrath on unrepentant sinners, and it will be in such a concentrated form that it'll be only God's mercy that you survive that time period. That wrath is coming too. So maybe you're not going through it now. Maybe this verse doesn't apply to you because God chooses who he pours his wrath out on, but ultimately at the end, there's going to be a generation who experiences what is described by the Bible as the eschatological day of wrath. It's called the day of the Lord. And you won't be able to escape that if you're living in that day. So my warning to you is, why don't you consider reading the parts of the Bible that you've been ignoring for so long? Why don't you consider taking God up on his word? Why don't you consider the fact that the only way to be in a right relationship with God and escape the wrath of God is to believe in his son Yeshua? That's my, not warning to you at this point in time, that's my offer to you. That's my a suggestion to you. That's what I can tell you about what's coming down the road. Okay? All right. We'll close with that. Let's call it quits for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.